Hi guys, I'm Pete aka on a retro tip and welcome to another cancelled games video. You're getting a whopping 25 this time, as there were just so many interesting unreleased games for the handheld that I had to mention all of these, and even then there are so many more that I won't mention. The Game Boy Advance was released in 2001 and was a surprisingly good upgrade in Nintendo's legendary Game Boy series. I had one back in the day and I've loved it ever since, and it's definitely one of my favourite handhelds. It has a fantastic library, including Advance Wars 2, which is one of my all-time favourite games, and I've been playing it solidly for the last month or so. But despite the plethora of decent titles released for the system, there are a huge amount of games that never saw the light of day. Join me as I take a look at 25 of those cancelled games. First up is Rick Dangerous Advance, a Game Boy Advance port of an Amiga game that I absolutely loved as a kid. In the game you play as Rick Dangerous, an Indiana Jones-like character, and make your way through platforming levels set in 4 distinct areas, while avoiding enemies and traps by jumping, shooting a pistol, or dropping dynamite. It can be terribly frustrating at times, as the layout of each level must be learnt through trial and error due to the cheap deaths caused by traps that are out of view until it's too late. The Game Boy Advance version looks almost identical to the Amiga's, which shouldn't have been too difficult given the superior hardware. It was cancelled because Rick Dangerous copyright holders didn't want to sell the license, so the developers scrapped the project. Shining Star was to be a military strategy game from eWorks Studios. No footage of this one, sadly only concept art, although eWorks seemingly created a playable prototype in which the player is in a deserted village in the South American jungle, fighting enemies with various guns and grenades. Despite the prototype being completed, the console was becoming outdated, with the DS having already been released, and they couldn't find a publisher for the game. A shame this one was cancelled, as the visuals look stunning, clearly taking inspiration from Metal Slug, a graphical style that I think suits the Game Boy Advance very well. And I also read that the developers were taking inspiration from Advance Wars, as I mentioned, one of my all-time favourite games. For me, that fact alone makes Shining Star a very intriguing prospect. Cyanide was released on the Xbox in 2006, and it's worth noting that this was the last exclusive release for the console. A side-scrolling shooter developed by PlayLogic Entertainment, it was originally developed for the Game Boy Advance by Engine Software. It looks fast-paced and has vibrant and colourful graphics, so it's a pity it was never released. Beyond it being originally developed for the handheld, I can't find any information on the Game Boy Advance version or its cancellation. Desolate World is actually a cancelled Amiga game, but after the Amiga version didn't pan out, the developers attempted to port the game to the Game Boy Advance. Reportedly made by a small Czech team, Desolate World began its development in the late 90s, which is obviously very late for an Amiga title and required some hefty specs. The footage you're seeing here is actually of the Amiga version, but I heard a demo of the Game Boy Advance version was knocking about, albeit with inferior graphics. This Amiga playable demo has one level, and if you're an Amiga or Bitmap Brothers fan like myself, you've probably already noticed a striking resemblance to Gods. I mean, it's really similar visually. And the similarities don't end there, as Desolate World's gameplay is just like that of Gods, an action platformer involving puzzle elements. Speaking of the Bitmap Brothers and Gods, in 2002 this press release appeared on the Bitmap Brothers website, indicating that Crawfish Entertainment would be bringing 3 Bitmap Brothers Amiga classics to the handheld. The aforementioned Gods, an action platformer based on ancient Greece, and just to clarify, the footage you're seeing of these games are the Amiga versions. The Game Boy Advance version was to feature updated level designs and improved graphics, which is quite the claim seeing as they're already stunning. The original levels would also be available to play after completing the game. Magic Pocket's another platformer, again with that distinctive Bitmap Brothers aesthetic. This port boasted additional maps interspersed with the game's original levels and some graphical tweaks. and the Chaos Engine, a game that would no doubt feature on many an Amiga fan's top 10. With visuals that look good even by Bitmap Brothers standards, the Chaos Engine is a top-down action game featuring 6 distinct characters and a multitude of weapons. The Game Boy Advance version, in addition to the single-player experience, was to support 2 to 4 players via link-up, with 16 multiplayer levels available for 2 players and an additional 16 for up to 4 players. The 3 games were designed specifically for the Game Boy Advance, but needless to say none ever saw release. Blue Angelo was originally released for Korean company Game Park's handheld, the GP32. I can't say that I've ever played one, but I do have their later handheld, the GP2X Wiz, which is awesome for emulators. Chances are you're thinking, what the fuck is a GP32? So that explains why the game didn't get much exposure, so a Game Boy Advance port was planned. The gameplay and visual style has a very anime feel about it. The player controls Creature 331, or Blue Angelo, who is a fighter created by the scientists of the planet Lyra in order to combat various monsters terrorising the planet. I guess it's best described as a sci-fi action platformer and features some lavish cutscenes. Reportedly 80% complete, the Game Boy Advance port of Blue Angelo was cancelled, but there are 2 different playable ROMs available. It looks great with multi-layered parallax scrolling, giving a real sense of depth to the levels. In 2016, Vetasoft ran a Kickstarter to bring a Blue Angelo reboot to PC, but this failed miserably, achieving less than €17,000 of its ambitious target of $250,000. There isn't much info available on this, but Chronicles of Eden Volume 1 Vanguard's Tale was to be a top-down RPG from Lightspire Studios. Announced in 2004, the game's story follows Dearvane, an agent on the Elven Council. Chronicles of Eden would have been set over 4 episodes and have 3 playable characters. After completing the first 2 episodes, a 4th character would become selectable. These characters would not only differ in abilities and playstyles, but would offer a differing perspective on the story. A release date was never stated, and for whatever reason the game just vanished. Dune Ornithopter Assault was a combat flight sim made by Soft Brigade and based on Frank Herbert's cult classic sci-fi book Dune. You play as Duncan Idaho, a pilot for House Atreides, and must pilot your ornithopter to fight against the evil Harkonnen for control of the planet Arrakis. I actually had no idea what an ornithopter was, but I looked it up and it's an aircraft that moves by flapping its wings, if you were wondering. The press release boasted a, quote, spectacular 3D universe, over 20 missions and 5 solo and multiplayer modes, the latter being played via a link cable. It also would have been the first Dune game released on a handheld. Development started in 2001 and was 80% complete by the summer of 2002 when it was cancelled due to its publisher Cryo Interactive having financial issues, but a playable ROM has been leaked online. Overstorm was an action platformer with pre-rendered graphics developed by Quantized Bit. I'm not sure of the game's storyline, but the levels have a barren, almost post-apocalyptic feel to them. It was shown at a convention in 2003, but disappeared until 2014 when the developers included a playable 5-level alpha of Overstorm with their latest game Vault Battery on the Loose. Flashback Legends was to be a Game Boy Advance entry in Delphine's Flashback series. It seems to retain the overall spirit of the original, with character movements and gameplay looking very similar, but it has that distinct Game Boy Advance feel as well. The game's world is very colourful and vibrant, in contrast to the beautiful but darker and more bleak jungle of the first game. Flashback Legends died along with Delphine in 2004, but a beta has since emerged online. Shinen Racer was being developed by Shinen Multimedia, who are known for their impressive graphics and sound in their Game Boy Advance games such as Iridium 2. The game ended up as more of a tech demo than a game, and wasn't completed as they had other commitments, but it still looks impressive. A top-down futuristic racer, it combines F-Zero-like aesthetics with the viewpoint and camera tracking of Micro Machines. 10 years later, in 2011, SHANIAE released Fast Racing League on the Wii, which is essentially a 3D version of SHANIAE Racer, but more akin to the traditional F-Zero style. The devs released a ROM of SHANIAE Racer online if you want to try it out. Not sure if I'm pronouncing this one right, but Odema and the Magic Book is a 2D run and gun / shooter developed by Namdo. It has some gorgeous cutesy graphics, and the run and gun levels are reminiscent of Metal Slug, while the shooter levels resemble Cotton. Odema boasted 7 huge worlds with branching paths, over 30 enemy types and a whopping 14 bosses. They produced a playable beta, but it's only around 75% finished and has no music or sound effects. A real pity that this never made it, because it looks great and would definitely be a game I would add to the collection. Reflex is a first-person shooter that was being developed by Graphic State. I have no idea why this was cancelled, but it seems to have been at least a fair way into development. Although the engine seems pretty impressive for a Game Boy Advance game, I was never really a fan of first-person shooters on handheld consoles, so its cancellation is no huge loss for me personally. GP Advance was developed in 2003 by Italian developer Prograph Research. Despite the less than optimal footage, this was a seriously impressive feat considering the hardware, as it looks amazing and runs very smoothly. Built around their own engine called DR Advance, which could achieve things on the handheld like no other. The studio's intention was to generate some hype around the engine and then follow up with an unlicensed Formula 1 game. There was considerable interest from publishers including EA, but after a few months of discussion the product's profitability was deemed to be too poor, and the game was very sadly scrapped. Spiral Stone was a planned action RPG developed in 2002 by Gatehouse Games, which was formed by ex-employees of Core Design. It looks like an interesting choice for the Game Boy Advance, and reportedly took inspiration from action RPGs on PC like Diablo. Spiral Stone was cancelled and was the only game the developers worked on. Broken Circle is an isometric RPG with turn-based combat and was developed by Seven Raven Studios. The story is based on Norse mythology, and the game has a cartoony but a little strange looking graphical style. The developers struggled to find a publisher due to concerns over the cost to produce the carts, which would have been 256 meg. They eventually got the size down to 64 meg, but by that time the console was nearing the end of its life, so the game remained unreleased. Seven Raven Studios released a ROM of the game online in 2009, and official carts of Broken Circle can be bought from Pico Interactive. Motocross Challenge is one of the most appealing games on the list for me. This sort of game is suited perfectly to the Game Boy's small screen, and the graphics are absolutely stunning. There are 10 different tracks with different events such as races against AI opponents, time trials, and a mode where points are awarded for performing stunts. Development eventually moved over to the DS, but that too was cancelled. DH Games released a ROM of the Game Boy Advance version online so you can download and play it, but the game eventually saw release on iOS in 2010. Tyrion 2000 was a PC game from Eclipse Studios, an updated version of their 95 release Tyrion. An acclaimed vertical shooter, a port of Tyrion 2000 was also planned for the Game Boy Advance. This port adds a new challenge mode wherein additional levels can be unlocked by completing the currently available levels. The publisher went bust and so the port was cancelled, but a ROM of the game was leaked online. If you haven't played Tyrion 2000 on PC, I thoroughly recommend it, and you can download it for free at GOG.com, and I'll leave a link in the description. Sanction, spelt with an X, was a side-scrolling shooter being developed in 2001 by Thalamus Interactive. Originally released in 1986 on the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum, the Game Boy Advance version was to be a remake featuring updated graphics and gameplay features. Ultimately, the investment proved to be too risky to publish Sanction, so it was cancelled, but a playable prototype was created. SHANTAE Advance, aka SHANTAE 2 Risky Revolution, was a planned SHANTAE sequel for the Game Boy Advance. The original SHANTAE on the Game Boy Color was developed entirely by developer Matt Bozon in his spare time, and is considered to be one of the handheld standout titles. The Game Boy Advance sequel was no different, with Matt again developing the entire game alone. For whatever reason, the rumour mill surrounding the game fizzled out altogether, and despite rumours of a DS release in the meantime, a new SHANIAE game wouldn't be seen until 2010 when Risky's Revenge came to the DS. SHANIAE Advance was intended to be a 20-hour experience across 8 chapters and was to include mini-games and a multiplayer battle mode. Some significant tweaks were also planned for the gameplay mechanics, with SHANIAE being able to move between 2 planes, the foreground and background, similar to Guardian Heroes, and the ability to swim, as well as some additional transformation abilities. A demo of the first world was created, but not publicly released. Diddy Kong Pilot was a racing game developed by Rare and was due to be published by Nintendo. Announced in 2001, Diddy Kong Pilot was a follow-up to Rare's fantastic N64 kart racer Diddy Kong Racing, based on Donkey Kong characters. In addition to the standard controls, the player would be able to pilot the aircraft using tilt controls built into the game cartridge. When Microsoft bought out Nintendo's stake in Rare in 2002, they could no longer use Nintendo-owned Donkey Kong characters, so the game was reskinned using Banjo-Kazooie characters which were owned by Rare, and was renamed Banjo Pilot. This entry is actually for 2 games, Phantom Ghost Who Walks and Mandrake the Magician Shadow of the Ven. Developed by 7th Sense Studios for the Game Boy Advance and planned for a 2003 release, both games were based on the 1930s comic book characters from Lee Falk. If you're my age, you'll most likely recognise the Phantom and Mandrake from Defenders of the Earth. And now you've probably got the theme tune stuck in your head. Phantom already featured in his own game prior to this with Phantom 2040 on the Mega Drive, Super Nintendo and Game Gear. Very little was known about either of the Game Boy Advance games except for rumours and a few screenshots, until a Phantom fan site called Chronicle Chamber uncovered ROMs for both games. In 2003, French publisher Microids obtained the licenses and asked 7th Sense Studios about making 2 games, but gave them almost complete freedom over the choice of genre. Both games were developed within a mere 8 months, and are both isometric action games using the same engine. Although very similar in appearance, they do differ vastly when it comes to the gameplay mechanics, with each game playing to the strength of its respective characters' abilities and with appropriate storylines to match. Microids went bust before the games were released, taking 7th Sense with them, but playable ROMs of each do exist. Although an interesting curio, the 3D rendered graphics don't seem to suit the Game Boy Advance as well as pixelated graphics, so perhaps the loss of these games isn't too hard to swallow. Command and Destroy was a planned real-time strategy game for the Game Boy Advance with a name dangerously similar to Westwood's classic of the genre, Command and Conquer. And the similarities don't stop at the name, as the game clearly took inspiration from the Command & Conquer series with regards to gameplay. Coincidentally set in 2018, you could play as one of 3 factions, humans, aliens or worms, and control over 50 unit types. The devs couldn't find a publisher, but Command & Destroy eventually saw release on the DS, and it's that version's footage that you're seeing here. REborn was a side-scrolling shooter developed by Neopol. They had some unforeseen issues with publishers, and despite the game having had some interest to begin with, they struggled to find one willing to take it on. The game reminds me of Hellfire on the Amiga and Mega Drive. The graphics are quite striking, mixing detailed clean sprites with colourful backgrounds and parallax scrolling. A shame it was cancelled, as it looks like a fun little shooter, but Neopong did eventually release the ROM online for free when they abandoned hope of finding a publisher. As with Broken Circle, Pico Interactive produced an official release of REborn. Jet Riders was developed by UK developer Bit Studios and was reportedly finished in 2003. Many people seem to describe it as a top-down wave race, but I immediately thought it resembled Micro Machines on jet skis. The main game mode is Challenge, which involves completing various races in order to gain stars, which in turn can be used to unlock new content such as new races, challenges and vehicles. There are some suitably quirky characters to choose from, and the game also has a multiplayer mode. Jet Riders looks awesome, definitely a game I would buy, and the graphics are lush. It has a fast and smooth feel to the pace of the races, and the ability to do various tricks such as flips and grinds makes it look really enjoyable. What a pity it was never released, and despite it receiving some favourable reviews, there doesn't seem to be any explanation why. So that was 25 of the many cancelled Game Boy Advance games, and I think this episode has showcased some of the best unreleased games we've seen in the series so far. Let me know what you thought of the games, and as always, thank you very much for watching.